Welcome back to the Lead Security YouTube channel, where we help churches become more inviting and more secure. My name is Preston Hocker. I've spent more than 20 years in full-time ministry. I'm also one of two owners of a private security firm that specializes in private investigation and close personal protection. Through Lead Security, we train church security teams around the country to stay ready, to stay vigilant, and prepared. Now, today's video might feel a little uncomfortable at first, but it's incredibly important. In today's episode, we're talking about Tim Larkin's book, When Violence is the Answer. Now, this isn't a Christian book, but I highly recommend it to anyone who's looking to understand how to survive violence from a cerebral approach. Like it or not, if your church is unprepared for violence, your people are vulnerable. So we need to make up our minds about violence, how we're going to respond to it before we are faced with it. Now, let's get into this. Larkin opens the book, When Violence is the Answer, with a hard truth. When you're faced with imminent violence, the only thing that stops it is a greater force. That's something churches struggle to accept. We want to lead with compassion, and we really should. But here's the lesson. Compassion doesn't cancel preparedness. So what does all this mean for the church? It means we need to stop confusing peacefulness with passivity. Jesus told us to be wise as serpents and to be gentle as doves. Now, being wise means you see danger clearly and you prepare for it, not after it happens, but before it happens. If you don't have a plan to stop violence when it shows up, you're putting people at risk. One of the big takeaways I personally got from When Violence is the Answer, the first time I read it, was when Larkin made an important distinction between social violence and asocial violence. Social violence is a fight that happens because of an ego or a status. You know the types, there's two guys that are just filled with the testosterone. They're 17-year-old kids. They meet at the football field to figure out who the big man really is. Asocial violence is predatory violence, where an attacker doesn't care about social rules. They just want to cause some harm. Now, this should matter to church leaders because church leaders at most are only prepared for social conflict. They're only prepared to de-escalate arguments, to diffuse some tension, or even just like counsel some difficult people. But the greatest threat to your church isn't going to be a loudmouth. It's going to be a quiet predator. Asocial violence is what happens when someone walks in with a gun intent on doing damage. There's no negotiating. There's no talking them down. And that's why your team needs more than just some soft skills. And I know I talk about soft skills and hard skills all the time, but both are important. One doesn't get to outweigh the other. You need people who are trained to recognize threats, to respond decisively and neutralize danger with swift and necessary force. One of the most important statements in the book, especially to the church, is that training for violence doesn't make you violent. It makes you prepared. I don't talk about it much on this channel. I don't even know if I've ever mentioned it because it doesn't seem too necessary to. But I competed in combat sports for more than a dozen years. I did everything from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and I had a bunch of mixed martial arts fights. I got started in combat sports as a result of trauma. When I was just 22 years old, a friend of mine was tragically murdered in a senseless act, and my fear response was to learn how to survive violence. If anyone wants to hear more from that story that I just mentioned, put it in the comments. I'd be happy to come back to it. Most people in my church were more than accepting of me competing in a cage or in a ring, especially when they heard my reasons. But there are some churchgoers who were convinced that I was demon-possessed or that I had sold my soul to the devil. There's a community of believers who are convinced believers are supposed to be utter pacifists and that self-defense is antithetical to the word of God. But the truth is believers aren't supposed to be doormats. When Jesus was being arrested, Jesus didn't rebuke Peter for cutting off the guard's ear because he was against all forms of violence. Jesus said it just wasn't the right time. Churches often avoid training for the worst case scenarios because they fear it's going to make people uncomfortable or they're going to feel like they've militarized their churches. But a church that prepares for violence doesn't mean it loves violence. It just means they love their people enough to protect them. Think of it this way. You don't install a fire alarm because you want a fire. You do it because lives depend on the fire alarms if a fire breaks out. Preparing for all types of violence is the same thing. It's not fear, it's stewardship. Larkin talks about the importance of training people to flip a switch, to go from calm to decisive action the moment it's needed. The reason so many people are victims of violence is due to our somewhat natural fear response to just freeze or to hesitate. So how does this apply to the church? Your security team needs permission. It needs preparation. It needs to know that it's allowed to act immediately when something goes wrong. That permission or authority comes from clarity. Clarity that comes from having clear roles. Clarity that comes from having clear authority that might come in the form of an actual certification from a state agency. It'll also come from having clear plans so everyone knows who is supposed to be doing what. See, we run into problems when we assume that just because someone's watching the door, they're ready to act. And the truth is, they really might not be. So you want to set up training that's realistic and that's regular with some professionals that know how to train your people. Don't train your team to fight a horde of zombies. Focus on maybe one or two attackers at most. And don't waste time responding to snipers in trees. Respond to the one guy with a handgun or a rifle because that's what is most reasonable. In a violent encounter, every second counts, so you can't plan on police coming to save you. About a year ago, we had a potential active shooter at my church. It took more than 45 minutes for the police to arrive from a 911 call.
3 hours later.
Here's the point. Calling 911 isn't a plan. It's a backup. Your church needs to own the responsibility to protect the people in the gap. The seconds or the minutes between danger showing up and help arriving, you need to have a plan what you're going to do. That's why the training you do before Sunday is irreplaceable. You can't afford not to train or prepare your team both physically and mentally. When Violence is the Answer may not be a Christian book, but its message is critical for Christians who take stewardship seriously. See, security isn't about paranoia. It's about protection. It's not about fear. It's about love. See, Jesus laid his life down for the world. The least we should be able to do or be willing to do is stand up for our community. If you want more training like this, both the mindset and the methods, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell since we're on YouTube and check out our online training at leadsecurity.com. If you aren't already following my Instagram, give it a follow. I drop tips and insights there every single day. And finally, get your hands on a copy of Tim Larkin's When Violence is the Answer. Give it a read and allow it to change your mind. Thanks again for joining me on the Lead Security YouTube channel. I'll catch you in the next one.